Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford and to our weekly research seminar. It's a pleasure to be hosting today. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center. And it's a real pleasure to welcome today three fantastic scholars to talk about a recent paper they've co-authored. Briefly introduce them in the author order of the paper. But they'll be talking to us today about social media and the pursuit of power in a hybrid regime using data they've collected from Pakistan. Dr. Asfandyar Mir is a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC, and he works on drones, counterinsurgency, sort of the new American way of war, let's say, with quite a bit of experience in South Asia, but also looking more globally at insurgency and terrorism issues. Professor Tamar Mitz is at Columbia University, where she focuses on social media and behavior of Islamic State supporters and related subjects, focus on political violence and conflict, and uses data science and machine learning to conduct her work. And finally, Professor Paul Staniland is at the University of Chicago, where he also works on political violence and international security with a focus on South Asia. So very much looking forward to the conversation today. Just as a reminder, you can post your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom whenever you like, and I will moderate the conversation at the conclusion of the presentation. And also just letting everybody know, the norm at CSAC is to let our pre and postdoctoral fellows ask the first few questions. So I won't necessarily be following the order in the Q&A box initially. Over to you, Asfandyar.
Well, actually, I'm going to be
Paul.
leading us off here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
No, not at all. Asfandyar's had a kind of globe-trotting last few days, so he'll be coming in Q&A, and tomorrow and I are going to be kind of doing the presentation, then he'll be jumping in for the Q&A. All right, so we've got about 20-25 minutes, so I'll be fairly brief here, and then I'll hand it over to Tamar. There has been a real explosion of research on politics and social media in the last few years. And there are a whole variety of areas in which we've seen that research develop. State repression and authoritarian rule, the spread of misinformation and propaganda, political polarization, attitudes and voting, so kind of more kind of classic bread and butter political behavior, and then areas around violence and extremism. This is a really rich, important, impressive line of research, but it tends to cluster into two types of political contexts. We have authoritarian regimes and kind of clearly or relatively democratic regimes. In authoritarian regimes, the research tends to be focused on a kind of states versus citizens or state versus society framing, in which states have substantial direct control over social media. And the contest is largely between kind of the state apparatus and a set of existing or potential dissidents and rebels who the state is attempting to manage and control. So research focused, for instance, on China and Saudi Arabia has attracted a lot of attention in recent years. At the other extreme, we see a lot of research on social media that kind of tries to bring it into a kind of normal politics framing of the standard kinds of questions we associate with liberal democratic politics. Social media becomes another pathway for political activity. And there's some kind of loose marketplace of ideas where different actors are kind of throwing ideas out into the world. Now, that doesn't preclude misinformation, disinformation, influence operations, but this is a realm in which there are a lot of different actors with substantial power that are kind of, at least to some extent, on a more equal playing field in terms of relative power. We're interested in a set of regimes that lie in between these two extremes, sometimes called hybrid regimes, depending on the specifics. We can think of a liberal democracy, competitive authoritarian, but places in which these ideal types kind of start to break down from the extremes, where there are still competitive elections. There are political parties, there are politicians, elections can to some extent matter in some ways, but also there may be government agencies, whether unified or fragmented, that are operating in ways that are kind of very different than in both of the extremes that existing research is focused on. So here we can see normal political mobilization that resembles democratic regimes. We can see government actors, either subtly or not so subtly, attempting to manipulate public opinion and information. We can see attempts by regime dissidents to kind of maneuver against the regime, find places of leverage and opportunities to kind of push their own narratives. And thus we can see a whole variety of different actors and different strategies kind of running into each other at the same time. And I think we have relatively little understanding of how social media operates in these kinds of environments, which we think are quite common relative to the two extreme cases, right? Most governments are neither the People's Republic of China nor, insert stable Western European democratic country here, right? The Netherlands. So in these environments, we see a variety of different actors. We can have a dissident sphere that has actual rebels or kind of nonviolent dissidents and potential dissidents, an electoral sphere in which different kinds of political parties compete with one another, often influenced by the media, trying to appeal to citizens and voters. And then we could have a regime sphere in which there are ruling parties, but also potentially a state media, different factions of a regime, and a security apparatus, which may or may not align very easily with the ruling party. And so we seek first to kind of disaggregate these different actors and then see how they relate to one another. Again, kind of posing this in contrast to the extremes that I led with. So what does looking at social media politics in this way help us see? We put our focus here theoretically on the kinds of coalitions that can emerge in these contexts, right? And so rather than seeing social media as necessarily reflecting either a simple struggle of state versus society, nor of necessarily reflecting straightforward democratic electoral competition, we think that different actors can align in very complicated, often very murky ways with one another. So to go back to this kind of little map thing, we could imagine cases in which the security apparatus is colluding with an opposition party against the ruling party. And we're going to provide evidence from one such case in just a few minutes. We could also see different parts of a regime kind of favoring different political parties, cultivating different media outlets, and potentially relating to dissidents in very different ways here. So we're looking at coalitions between actors, in part by looking at which narratives are being advanced by who, kind of who is saying similar things and who is opposing those, right? And one useful potential kind of both the theoretical and empirical value added here is being able to measure dynamics of alignment, even in contexts in which kind of gold standard qualitative evidence of collusion or tacit coalition is going to be very hard to find. Right? So we can see, well, we may not know for sure that actor A and actor B are working together, but it may be no coincidence they're advancing very similar narratives against some third actor, actor C, right? So we think that especially these kind of in-between regimes, these coalitional dynamics will be really essential to understanding the politics of social media. Second, we suspect that these weakly institutionalized and competitive environments may be the most ripe for different kinds of coordination strategies, bots, troll armies, disinformation. Again, these are not in any way unique to these environments, right? But we think they may have distinctive effects in combination with these coalitional politics that make it really important to study them. Now, we can also see kind of organic enthusiasm, illicit means of coordinating messages and boosting narratives, right? But there's kind of going to be a fusion or a combination of the two, organic plus artificial or kind of accelerated forms of narrative advancement. Now, I also do want to add that we've kind of placed this in between, right? But I suspect that a number of the dynamics we're going to be talking about here may have extensions into these extreme cases, right? So these are just some examples from the contemporary United States, where parts of the American state bureaucratic apparatus basically have become tools or became tools of the Trump administration's campaign. Right. These are just a couple of examples with, the press secretary of the Department of the Interior should be like the world's least controversial position in the US government, I suspect. Right. But here they're referring to the rotten stench of the prior administration. The Department of Homeland Security's online presence was like basically had Trump 2020 plastered all over it. And so we think that they're echoes or resemblances of what we find in these kind of murkier hybrid regimes, even in kind of more classically, at least typically, liberal democratic contexts. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're trying to map out this new conceptualization and then identify some theoretical implications. Then we're going to start moving into an empirical study of a particular context, primarily Pakistan's general election in 2018. We're also going to show some data from before and after that election, trying to show that this focus on coalition and coordination provides real value added. It lets us measure and see things that are difficult otherwise, especially if we adopt one of the rating conceptualizations of social media and politics. By way of very brief political background here, in 2018, we see a very important general election in the country. The current Prime Minister, Imran Khan, and his PTI, now the ruling party, they win a decisive, fairly substantial victory over the incumbent Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and a set of other political parties. So here's a case in which an opposition party defeats a ruling party. Okay. Sounds straightforward so far. Both invested a lot in voter mobilization, political outreach in various different ways, right? So this is a real election in some very important respects. But there are also recurrent and we think fairly credible allegations that the playing field was tilted against the incumbent ruling party by Pakistan's politically powerful military. So there's a lot of reporting on censorship, for instance, intimidation, different ways in which the military, sometimes in collusion with other political actors, was trying to shape the way that these dynamics of competition played out, right? And so generally we see Pakistan being coded as some kind of hybrid, quasi-Praetorian guardianship, some kind of regime that is neither straightforwardly authoritarian, a la North Korea or China, but also not kind of straightforwardly democratic. And so here we're going to be examining Pakistan's digital environment. Now, on the one hand, Pakistan is coded by, for instance, Freedom House as not free on the net, including digital election interference. There's certainly substantial evidence of coordinated inauthentic behavior. So an example here, Facebook took down a set of actors linked to Pakistan's military. So that's certainly all true. On the other hand, Twitter and other social media outlets were areas of serious contestation in this election. The main political parties actively mobilized support. The military has a notable Twitter presence from which it has kind of offered very important pronouncements on big issues of politics. It also was kind of like a go-to source during the February-March 2019 crisis with India. So, the Inter-Services Public Relations Twitter account was tweeting out photographs from the site of airstrikes. So it's something that attracts real attention. There's also finally a fairly robust dissident sphere that's tried to use Twitter as well as other social media platforms to highlight military intervention in politics, human rights abuses, and to publish content that was censored in newspapers. Okay. And so let's see, Tamara, am I going to hand it over to you on this slide or the next slide?
The next slide.
The next slide. Okay, so what we're going to be doing here is, I can't see the slide numbers. We're going to be examining political discourse and sentiment. So what are people online talking about? Which actors? And are they saying good things or bad things about at least a subset of them? Which issues are they talking about? Corruption, the judiciary, the military, human rights, India, foreign policy more broadly. So we're going to look at a set of actors and a set of topics, right? And within some of those, looking at sentiment. We're going to be interested in narrative alignments or opposition between the army and different political parties. We're going to provide some evidence of alignment between the army and what was at that point the main opposition party, the PTI, which is now the ruling party, and examine some interesting, though very tentative and preliminary evidence of coordinated activity. And so this analysis is guided by this kind of coalition and coordination framework. And okay, I'm going to now stop my screen sharing and hand it over to Tamara.
Sorry about that, I was muted. Hi everybody. So what I will talk about next is how we try to measure those concepts in the context of the run-up to the 2018 election in Pakistan and highlight some of the patterns that we found. So for this, what we did was to draw on two different sources of data. First, we collected large amounts of Twitter data that we collected in real time from Twitter's public APIs. And that data in particular focuses on content in Urdu and in English that we analyzed with various text analysis methods. What we looked for in the content is several things. So first, we were interested in discourse on actors. So which party was talked most about? What are the type of political issues that were discussed? We also looked at sentiment pro and against different actors. We used the text of the posts to measure these things. We had a lot of data, about 11 million tweets that were posted by over 3 million accounts. In addition, we were interested in what the actors themselves, the main actors in this context, were talking about. So for that, we used Facebook data from their public pages, and we did similar analysis to understand what they talked about and to what extent their narratives were aligning or not with each other over time. So just a brief explanation of how we collected the Twitter data. We started with a seed account of a lot of handles that were of prominent political actors in Pakistan. These include political parties, the media, different actors from civil society, as well as dissidents. Then what we did was to get all the followers of these accounts, and we collected information on what the followers themselves posted. So that kind of data collection method allowed us to create a picture of what Twitter users in Pakistan who are following these accounts are talking about in the run-up to the election. In addition, like I said, we have Facebook data from CrowdTangle on what the main actors were posting over the course of 10 years. We have more time range in this data source. Then we used two different text analysis methods to understand what has been said. The first one was a dictionary approach, where we coded posts for whether or not they included keywords that were associated with a particular topic. We had that done in English and in Urdu. You can see here on the slide the political actors that we looked at, particularly the PTI, the party that won the election, PMLN, which was the ruling party up until then, and the army. And we also looked at different topics that relate to policy issues that are relevant to the Pakistani context, like corruption, the economy, India, and militancy, and several others as well. In addition to the dictionary approach, we also used several machine learning classifiers to identify more nuanced references to political actors and issues in Urdu tweets in particular. So for that, we trained several models on labeled data, and the figure on the right shows you the out of sample accuracy, particularly the models basically performed really well in detecting the topics that we were interested in. So what I'll show you next is what we found. So when we look at just discourse on actors across the full sample, we found that no matter the method we use, whether we use a dictionary with keywords or machine learning classifiers, pretty much we find that the PTI dominated the discourse. We had way more posts on the PTI than the other two actors. The variation in terms of how much the PTI was discussed varied by language and by measure, but overall we find that the PTI certainly dominated the discourse on Twitter in that period. We also found, when we looked at the topics, is that issues that relate to corruption, India, the judiciary, foreign policy, tended to be the most talked about in that time period on the Pakistani Twitter sphere. And some of these topics are actually topics that were often pushed by the PTI. So there's also not only salience of the actor, but also of the topic or the issues that were being discussed at the time. In terms of sentiment, we find that pro-PTI and anti-PMLN, which both of these are favoring the PTI, conceptually tended to also be the most frequent in terms of tweets that we found in the database. Interestingly, we find that even though the military has been argued to be a big part of, leveling the playing field, on Twitter itself, there was relatively less discourse on the army. So we'll maybe get back to that later, but that's what we found in different estimations. Another way to look at the data is just plot it over time. So this graph shows you the sentiments pro against these three actors in the months before and after the election. There's a lot of things we can point to in this graph, but I would just like to highlight, for example, that right before the election day, we definitely see this increase in pro-PTI sentiment. We also see that some censorship shocks that we measure seem to have driven, at least in the time series sense, content that relates to the PTI, favoring the PTI and anti the PMLN. So these are just a lot of interesting nuances we can talk about here that I won't have time now to go into a lot of detail. But then what we wanted to do, in addition to just observing aggregate patterns in the data, was to look at to what extent we see evidence of narrative alignment. So this idea of, something we might not see in one or two media posts, but if we look at a long time period across thousands and thousands of posts, do we see evidence of this alignment? So what we found here was when we looked at the Facebook data, these are coming from the official pages of these main actors, we find that the similarity in the language, the kind of language that was being used by the PTI and the army on the left and the PMLN and the army on the right actually look quite different. So we see this similarity increasing over time between the PTI and the army, and actually decreasing between the army and the PMLN. Of course, there's much more we can do with this data, but this is kind of the first cut evidence that we have. In addition, we looked at how different followers of these accounts, so if you think about echo chambers of different or different clusters of followers of different actors, imagine PTI supporters on one end, for example, and PMLN supporters on the other, we were interested in knowing whether the content that was being circulated in these networks tended to favor each of these actors differently. What you see in these figures, especially this one on the left, is that the pro-PTI content definitely swamped the rhetoric and the content that was being circulated in PMLN clusters even, which suggests against this idea of echo chambers, and more, it seems to be more evidence of this narrative that is being circulated in a lot of different clusters, regardless of who they tend to follow the most. So this led us to another type of analysis that we were interested in is, okay, so if PTI is so popular and so, discussed so much on the platform, to what extent this could be a function of coordinated activity? And for that, what we did was to draw on qualitative evidence that actually came from different people who looked at this phenomenon, was to examine the extent to which distinct users have been pushing the same message separately, kind of to create content that will push a certain narrative. Now, unlike having one post that is being amplified or retweeted many, many times, we're talking here about posts that are actually separate, but are still very similar. So the example on the bottom, you can see here 3 Twitter posts by 3 different users that are basically saying the same thing. They're almost exactly the same post, but they're actually not identical. There are some little variations in the content. And we were interested to know to what extent this type of narrative of coordinated activity was present in the run-up to the Pakistani elections in 2018. And for that, what we did was to create a measure of users who have been behaving like this over the course of the run-up to the election, and then looked at the extent of tweets that look just like that, that are very, very similar in the content, but might not be identical. What we found when we looked at those types of tweets, we found that, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, that pro-PTI and anti-PMLN, again, the same content that was very prevalent, was the the content that was posted the most by these accounts. We also find that pro-army content, you can see it here in this blue-green color, basically shows that even though the army tended to be a very small share of the overall discourse, it actually had a higher proportion in the coordinated Twitter accounts activity. We also found, when we looked at which of these tweets were most likely to be amplified further by retweeting, we found that the pro-army and pro-PTI were the top 2 categories, and anti-PMLN was the third category that were most retweeted of these coordinated accounts. So again, this is some evidence we found. It's not conclusive, but it's definitely suggests that maybe these coordinated accounts that we found pushed a particular narrative that helped the PTI, maybe helped the PTI later in the election. Okay, so I'm going to move it, switch. Paul will talk about the conclusion, and then we'll happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tamar. So I think this is, obvious. This has taken a long time to do the project, but actually writing the paper has been a fairly recent occurrence. So we're still trying to figure out what we have here and what we want to do moving forward. What are some things we might be able to take away here? First, we think that this focus on coalition and coordination are useful and measurable concepts for understanding social media politics. I think we see at least plausible evidence here that there are dynamics that are not reducible strictly either to the state versus society, nor to the dynamics of kind of normal electoral competition, right? That's not to say that a normal electoral competition dynamics are irrelevant. It's also not to say that state power and manipulation are irrelevant, but instead that kind of both of these are happening simultaneously in very complicated ways. And what we are trying to do is kind of pull this apart, create a new analytical way of doing it, and some new empirical ways of trying to actually measure it, tangibly. And strikingly, we see the army or the military, which is part of the state, the ruling apparatus, seeming to, and this is consistent with other accounts of the election, kind of offer similar narratives and messages to the opposition party against the nominal ruling party that the military is constitutionally subservient to. So that's interesting. This suggests the importance of indirect methods of influence. So we have evidence of direct methods of influence as well, such as censorship and intimidation and kind of money changing hands. But we think there's also this set of indirect mechanisms that may be complementary to those more direct mechanisms. Something we didn't have a chance to touch on much here, but there seems to be a real limit to Twitter and social media in general as a technology of liberation. People like me pay a lot of attention to this dissident sphere on Twitter. Relative to the rest of the content, it gets absolutely swamped out by the big political parties and some of these issues that are not central to what the dissident sphere was focusing on at all. And then finally, we think there may be some implications for foreign influence operations that, depending on the kind of domestic cleavages, coalitions, and kind of structures of political competition, there may be contexts in which foreign intervention or foreign influence operations are likely to be highly successful by piggybacking on top of these coalitional conflicts. There may be others in which foreign influence operations kind of have nowhere to latch onto. The kind of what foreigners want is somehow orthogonal or irrelevant to the main issues of contestation in a domestic social media sphere. And this is just an early thought, but we'd like to expand on it in the future. And so what are we going to do next? Well, we'd like to strike a balance of kind of between these different concepts, theories, evidence, think harder about what are scope conditions here. Is this just a generally applicable framework? Is it more specific to hybrid regimes? Is it totally wrong everywhere? Kind of what other kinds of evidence would people like to see? And then we're thinking about some future projects moving forward that are kind of more focused on more specific empirical questions, but we wanted to get this kind of bigger thick paper out into the world earlier first. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Harold.
Terrific, everybody. That was great. Looking forward to the discussion. Just a reminder to everybody, go ahead and enter your questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom. And I will read out the questions before going back to Asfandyar, Paul, and Tamar. And we'll start out with a question from one of our CSAC fellows, Jeff Ding. He asks, do we see coalition coordination dynamics happening in non-social media politics? For instance, military leaders writing op-eds, helping to campaign, etc. So over to you to decide who wants to take the first crack at this.
So I can try to answer that. Yes, there in the non-social media context, I think there's been extensive reporting of this kind of coalition politics alignments. But as Paul pointed out, in this sort of murky interaction of the state apparatus, the regular electoral sphere, and dissidents, these linkages are often suggestive and hard to establish. Journalists talk about it because they are hearing things, from the grapevine. Politicians are sort of dropping hints, but there's no sort of good way to map it out, or there's often no smoking gun evidence. So I think our evidence from the digital sphere is another data point in that direction that we that we sort of hear from the non-social media context, but no op-ed writing, direct sort of op-ed writing. There are people who write op-eds, who are aligned with either either various political parties or the military. That happens a lot, but there's sort of no direct endorsement, as maybe common in some other contexts. Maybe does that happen in Myanmar, Paul? You would know. Is there any op-ed writing there? Okay.
No, they give the military gives speeches or pronouncements. A spokesperson says something, and everybody's like, "Uh-oh," right? So I think these dynamics of kind of shaping and coalitional alignment are certainly, I think, quite common in general. But I think they may be easier or take on distinctive dynamics in the social media space that we think are interesting and important.
Great. The next question is from Hamad Sarfraz, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, who's joining us from Pakistan. He asks, do you think online narratives translate into offline action in developing countries where the majority that actually casts votes is not using social media?
So I'll start with this. This is a great question. And in the paper, we kind of acknowledge that this is a real challenge in a couple of ways. Asfandir, I'm going to bracket this for you to talk about the Pakistani case if you're comfortable. You have some insights on kind of internet penetration that would be useful here. I think one reason we're being really cautious about pushing the effects claims here is that we don't know if this has any effect, right? I mean, it's possible on voting, like mass voting behavior. There are ways that we've thought about trying to get at this. I wouldn't think that Twitter would necessarily be the most obvious way through which kind of large-scale mass voting behavior in any country, the U.S., Pakistan, anywhere, necessarily, is occurring, right? I think it could nevertheless provide insight into political strategies, kind of what these actors are doing. They're investing a lot of time, resources, effort, at least at the kind of elite or quasi-elite level, which I think in these kinds of regimes tells us something pretty important. But we did not make any claims in this talk that this necessarily then leads to variation in vote shares, right? We can't say that at this point. Asfandir, I'll hand it over to you on this.
Sure, and Tamar, please feel free to jump in and correct me. But so for a separate project, I have we've been running a survey in which we found that Twitter, in fact, is the least used social media sort of medium in Pakistan. It's actually even behind TikTok. So TikTok is sort of more pervasive, is used a lot more. Facebook's fairly popular. WhatsApp, of course, is a key source of information, political information. So there are limits to Twitter, how much it penetrates the public. And then in addition, as Paul pointed out, like even in the US context, we've not been able to sort of find a lot of evidence that social media has made difference in political behavior to an extent where it is pushing vote margins across a certain limit. That being said, I think that we have to recognize that powerful political actors see this media as being consequential to electoral fortune. So these are two major political parties, large political parties, who are trying to sort of navigate an massive electorate, and they end up spending a lot of time and energy on this kind of mobilization. So they clearly think that this has some effect. But what is that causal chain? Is it sort of, is there a one-to-one connection with electoral politics at the constituency level? I think I doubt it. I think I have some other theories as to how it can affect, but that's all still very preliminary, and we don't have any good evidence to make claims on on offline impact as yet.
Yeah, and I would like to add that more generally, when we think about the effects of online engagement with offline behavior, this is something that is true for other contexts as well. Many believe that there is an effect in some ways and through some channels. In terms of empirical research on the topic, this is probably the most challenging area to measure. And I believe that more research will come in the next few years to kind of illustrate the extent to which engagement online affects voting behavior, for example. And this is beyond even Pakistan.
Terrific. Next question is from CSAC affiliate David Elliott. He asks, can you see explicit involvement of the intelligence component of the military in politics through social media? They certainly powerfully affect the government's security strategies, so they might be tempted to test this avenue as another way of strengthening their influence and controls.
You want to take that first, Estefan?
Sure. So, the short answer is no, and the reason is that I think it's, we are ultimately observing behavior, and it's hard to tell who's sort of behind it actually. I mean, there are no direct accounts of the military or the intelligence apparatus, but there are suggestions that the military and intelligence are sort of operating. So all this coordination we're saying, one theory or one hypothesis is, and it's an important one. It's a plausible one that it's that there's some component of the intelligence apparatus which is pushing this coordinated behavior. But we're still sort of trying to devise tests which can more affirmatively get at this question.
Just to clarify, there is a military account, inter-services public relations, and then what we did is we kind of looked at who's following that, and also kind of qualitatively identified people and who seemed to be kind of fairly sympathetic to this kind of approach. Let's put it that way. And so we did kind of clusters of individuals who could be seen to be sympathetic to and kind of consistently aligning with the military in particular areas. What the nature of that relationship is, obviously, it depends a lot on the context and can be very murky, but you can kind of identify pro-military sentiment. The question then is who exactly is doing what within that, and that's obviously a much murkier question.
So I might take chair's privilege here to jump in with a question. So in other cases that I'm familiar with, of sort of hybrid regimes, well, in the case of Venezuela, now authoritarian regimes, you see the incumbent tends to have the advantage in this kind of messaging, if only because they can invest state resources in it. They can mobilize and legitimize patriotic trolls. They can do actual coordinated social media campaigns through their followers. And set up quite an elaborate system to do this. But the case in Pakistan that you're discussing here seems to show the opposite. So is this just a case that the PMLN is just bad at this, or the PTI is really good, or what do you think is going on that drives this difference that from what maybe my intuition would have led me to expect before hearing your work?
So I think it's clearly the case that the PTI is quite good at this, right? So we would expect, just looking at election results, that the PTI would do better than the PMLN, and knowing we know about kind of general areas of support, we would expect the PTI to be kind of have a more enthusiastic online presence, given kind of what we think we know about the demographic profile. We see a lot more than that, and we also see much more evidence of coordinated activities. So it suggests not just that there's like organic enthusiasm, there is that, but also there's some of this other stuff that appears to be going on. In a case like Venezuela, you don't have as the kind of rupture between civilian and military power that we do in a lot of other cases, right? And so here, like, what does the regime or the state mean, right? We have a political party that's a ruling party that controls parts of a bureaucracy that are very important to patronage resources, but also part of the state that is de facto autonomous. So there are cases that are more like that and less like that, right? Egypt, kind of at various points with a politically autonomous military, contemporary Myanmar, where big chunks of the state are explicitly controlled by the military. I think are going to look really different than a Venezuela, where you see kind of I don't know anything about Venezuela, but a more cohesive regime kind of facing off against an opposition.
That's a very fair point. Tamar Asfader, do you want to jump in, or should we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of double down on that I think within the category of hybrid regime, the cases or concepts are most applicable to are where you have de facto sort of autonomous militaries, so Myanmar, Egypt, Thailand. I think those are cases we're closer to than say Venezuela.
I think you could also imagine factionalized regimes. So think about contemporary Iraq, right, where there's just like a bunch of actors controlling different parts of different ministries. I have no idea if this applies to Iraq, but just kind of thinking about scope conditions, you could think of cases like that as well.
Yeah.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Aidan Millif writes, thank you all for a really interesting presentation. Two questions. First is, given who uses Twitter in Pakistan, were you surprised that the PTI was the most discussed, most salient, or did that match expectations? I think you might have addressed this a little bit just now. How do you think the dynamics you find would differ in a country with more Twitter users? And then the second question is, does the network structure of your data allow you to say anything about how those coordinated messages diffuse across Pakistani Twitter over time? What are the characteristics of accounts that are most effective at seeding messages that later spread widely?
So I think I'll start with that. Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think kind of speaks to where we're going with this project next. So what we presented so far was kind of first cut findings and what we have at the moment. There are clearly more we could do. So I'll start with your second question, which is about how do these coordinated accounts look like? Are there more effective ones, less effective ones? How their behavior looks like over time? I think that these are great questions that I don't have at the moment plots and figures to show what it looks like, but this is something we're certainly interested in measuring. In addition, we're interested in measuring the networks between these accounts. At the moment, we just identified them based on their online behavior and their posting behavior. So I think this is something that is an empirical question that we want to answer. As to your first question, and I'm curious to hear what Paul and Asfan think as well. The Pakistani case is one where you have a particular demographic, and this is true for other countries, but particular demographic that use the platform, and a relatively smaller proportion of the population relative to other countries uses Twitter. So if you think of the content being circulated on that platform as having any effect, one hypothesis would be that in places where the Twitter penetration is just wider, you would have maybe a bigger electoral effect if there was any. But I think I would like the other speakers to speak to Pakistan more specifically.
One thing I'll just briefly say is it's not clear that any of this is unique to Twitter, right? I mean, Tamar provided really fascinating Facebook data. Certainly the Indian case, which, I know recently, well, WhatsApp is used by the ruling party, by everybody, right? But, there are kind of people whose job it appears to be to kind of pump out narrative on WhatsApp. So it's going to look a little bit different in terms of the empirical manifestation, but thinking kind of at a higher level about how information flows are being kind of directed and pushed out, we could imagine some version of this applying to a whole lot of different platforms in ways that I think would probably look a little bit different, but kind of the basic insights might still travel.
And in terms of surprises, I think what we've been most surprised by is the fact that the military, despite being in the offline context, despite being talked about so much, having influenced Pakistani politics, over the last 50, 60 years, the amount of content, sentiment pertaining to the military was fairly limited, at least in the lead up to the election. And I think it sort of defied our priors in two ways. First, we thought that, given people were talking so much about it, there would be more discussion. I think the other way was that it pushed back against this thesis of liberation technology. I don't know if Larry Diamond is on the call, but I think at the time of Arab Spring, there was this optimism that social media would be sort of this force for good, and it would really provide an avenue of political mobilization for the dissident sphere, for opposition politics against autonomous institutions, like powerful militaries. Clearly, that has not happened in the Pakistani context, and from what we know, also it's not happening in other contexts as well. And instead, autonomous actors are really weaponizing social media to their advantage. So yeah, that was the other sort of big surprise.
Great. I think the next question is somewhat related from an anonymous participant. It asks, were there coordinated posts? For example, pro-PTI coordinated posts followed by a flurry of coordinated pro-PMLN posts?
I guess Aswan, you can also answer this question, but we started looking at the content in kind of the aggregate. We haven't yet looked at this pattern, which I think is really interesting because it also suggests, maybe there are different types of, likely there are different types of troll or campaigns, or coordinated campaigns. And one way to see their interaction is to look at their kind of the timing of content from particular accounts. One more thing we haven't done yet with the data.
But I'd venture given the evidence on swamping, like the fact that the post-PTI sentiment was able to sort of really permeate even the PMLN's clusters or the dissident cluster, I would be surprised to find vigorous competition like this kind of pro-PTI or pro-military sentiment being countered with pro-PMLN coordinated activity. It would be there probably. But I don't think it would be there at any significant scale. But yes, we haven't seen the data yet.
All right. I think the next two questions could almost go together. So maybe I'll from Jacqueline Hazelton, one of our visiting scholars from the Naval War College, asks, how would you think about generalizing this work in theoretical terms? And one of our postdoctoral fellows, Julien de Lamversin, asks, it seems to me that all the dynamics in social media you study in this work could very well happen in democratic systems, for example, the United States and social media in the last elections. Would you explain why it makes sense to adopt different approaches, models to study politics and social media in hybrid and democratic systems? So I think those are at least adjacent sets of questions.
All right, well, I'll take a first swing at this. So hi, everybody. Hi, Jacqueline. Okay, so this theoretically, I think we could make a claim that in, let's call them hybrid or illiberal democratic contexts, and let me caveat that to come back with regard to the second question. We should expect to see coalitions among state and party actors that are not reducible to kind of normal electoral competition. That is to say, we should see coalitional arrangements, we should see coordination happening that doesn't just like reflect the balance of relative popularity or kind of licit mobilization strategies, right? There are other actors and other games being played that kind of complicate straightforward democratic competition, as at least some people have characterized it, right? And similarly, theoretically, we would expect to see different dynamics that in kind of clearly consolidated authoritarian regimes, where there should be much less of these coalitional arrangements and instead a much more kind of straightforward oppositional framing, right? The state versus its citizens, or the state and its regime allies against the opposition. My colleague Lisa Wadeen has some really interesting work in Syria on how that latter dynamic worked with, lots of misinformation, but doing something different than what we're seeing here. It wasn't about coalition building. It was more about kind of like just clouding the atmosphere and coalition breaking down, I guess I should say. And then coordination activities should in turn reflect these coalitional dynamics, including actors using like non-organic methods to advance particular narratives. So that, I don't know if that's, I mean, this started honestly as kind of an iterative, empirical, inductive project. I think we're trying to move toward more explicit hypotheses and theoretical statements. And that's kind of like where I'm thinking right now, for what that's worth. And I'm curious what other folks think on that. In terms of democratic versus hybrid, the reason that slide about DHS and the Interior Ministry, sorry, not the Interior Ministry, the Department of the Interior, very different, is in there is because we think a lot of this may actually apply to a lot of democratic contexts. But when you look at a lot of the way social media research is done in democracies, it's like, oh, well, we've got the press, we've got politicians and parties, and then we have social media that shows up. And it's like another thing that looks similar to the others, except, it's done through computers in different ways. And that may be a framing that does not sufficiently capture the ways in which things like manipulation and coalitions can be occurring even in these contexts. So maybe it's like there's a more capacious space here than we currently frame it. And that would be great, actually. I think that would be really helpful.
Heard you mute.
Tamar, Asfandiar, just seeing if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think Paul summarized where we are on the theory side really well.
All right. Moving on to one of our predoctoral fellows, Austin Cooper. Can you say more about the insights from your research in Pakistan on US social media politics? What does something like political capture of ostensibly non-political outlets have to say about democratic governance? Why has social media made these institutions, quote unquote, vulnerable to politics?
Are you?
That's
I can. So, so I think, I mean, this is a building off Paul's answer to the last question. In the US context, you don't have a regime sphere, you know, quite in the same way as, you know, as the Pakistani context. There's also no real dissident sphere. There's, you know, essentially, effectively, a fairly competitive electoral sphere. But even within that, there have been suggestions of coordination, and I think the Pakistani case sort of provides some directions in which we can look at coordination in the US context. There's also been this question of like foreign interference and like what kind of foreign interference in the US context can be effective, or, you know, can be damaging, or, you know, particularly pernicious. And I think the key insight from the Pakistani case is that that a smart foreign adversary has to really sort of has to understand these coalitions and narrative alignments, and adjust themselves in that context in order to be really effective. But I think that's kind of where we are. We hoped, starting out, that maybe we'll learn something about political behavior, maybe something related to voting. We're not quite there yet. So I think that's kind of the limit of what we can say. Obviously, these are two very different contexts, and yeah.
One more thing that I would like to add is that when we talk about coalitions, in what we're trying to understand in the Pakistani cases are coalitions that might not be observed for strategic reasons. So there is maybe a reason to push a particular narrative in a way that would seem more organic. And the coalition or the accounts behind that narrative might not want to be seen as a coalition necessarily. I think that in other contexts, like the United States, who against whom is a bit more clear. And I think that this again goes back to what Paul, the kind of the framework we're working with, which is the different spheres and how different countries look like when we think of these dissident, electoral, and the regime sphere. So I think this also speaks to how we're thinking about this theoretically. And but I do agree with the comment that understanding how Pakistan would compare to the US would compare to another case in the context of coalitions, for example, would be an important thing to think about more.
Great. Next question is from Jim Fearon. I may have missed this coming in late, but in trying to identify coordinated behavior, can you exploit the time of postings as well as the content? Could you use timing to identify network connections? He asks, maybe.
I can answer this. Yes. So we actually, I don't know if you heard it or not, because I kind of ran through this a little bit quickly, but the way we identify those coordinated accounts was in 2 steps. The first one was to identify for the full time period accounts, user level accounts that tended to post frequently within a week, similar posts. And then the posts themselves that we pulled for the analysis we presented were those that within a 3-day period had a high degree of similarity. We used cosine similarity in particular. So we did use kind of both user level across the entire period as well as post level for the 3-day windows. Maybe that's not exactly what you were thinking about, but that we're trying to think in that way as well. So hopefully that captures that concept.
Okay, from Jill Hazelton. How does this work converge with and diverge from work by Mark Lynch and others on social media in the Middle East? His work is more focused on causation, for example, I think.
I can jump in tomorrow. I don't know if you want. Okay. Yeah. So I'm most familiar with Lynch's work kind of on two things. One is TV networks and kind of the Arab public sphere, and then some of his work on kind of social media, Egypt, the rise and fall of democratization. I think there's obviously a lot of convergence there, a lot of similarities. I think what I would say maybe we add a little bit is a different way of, or a new way of thinking about a framework for thinking about these different actors and their relations with one another. And I think linking kind of patterns of online content to specific institutions, including parties and members of the state apparatus, and then kind of situating them relative to one another, and then exploring kind of how they get their narratives out there, I think would be something that is a little more explicit and kind of conceptual in what we're doing. But I don't think there's unless I'm missing something, I don't think there's like a fundamental tension with what he's looking at. Certainly thinking of like his Century Foundation report or stuff he's done for Carnegie on this. I will say, a lot of the work that came out of the beginning of the 2010s was about the ways in which you'd see kind of the emergence or the breakdown of monolithic public opinion. Right, there's a rise of a new sphere, kind of contentious. And I think a lot of that already existed in the Pakistani case. So what we're seeing is not the growth of a new sphere, but instead kind of the knife fights within an existing sphere that's already quite polarized, already divided among different actors, and then this playing out in the social media sphere.
And quickly on causation, so there isn't a lot of sort of causal inference in this paper. And that's for a reason, because I think our sense is that the space on politics and social media needs more conceptual work as to what needs to be kind of explained, and what are the key concepts whose effects need to be measured, and we hope that this work will count towards that.
Jim Farron had a quick follow-up, so I'm going to ask that, and then I'll go to Melissa Carlson. He asks, what about very rapid follow-up, like within an hour, say, which might indicate a focus campaign with a central directive? So maybe tomorrow?
Yes, that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, we did not look at that granularity of time, but we could certainly do that, and I thank you for the suggestion.
Thanks. From Melissa Carlson, one of our Middle East Initiative postdoctoral fellows, she asks, I would love to hear more detail about the role of non-state actors in creating and promoting these aligned media narratives, thinking in particular about prominent NGOs and charities that may coordinate with the administration and or the political opposition to promote and legitimize their interests.
So in the Pakistani context, at least, we have not found a substantial role of, or at least a substantial scale of these non-state actors. They exist. Civil society actors are important. Dissidents, human rights activists, they are extremely vibrant, and interact and sort of get into fights and dialogue. But in the aggregate, they kind of pale compared to the presence, scale, enthusiasm of these party machines or social media machines aligned with the military. So, which was again surprising. I think going in, we thought that given sort of the liberation technology, wisdom, understanding that perhaps the dissident sphere would be reaching a lot of scale. These non-state actors, civil society actors would be major players. But at the national sort of electoral level, I think their messaging still struggles to scale.
And I'll just jump in, kind of looking at Melissa's question here about this is the one about NGOs and charities as well. I think one place in which this also plays out is media, in which there are different kind of media houses, different TV channels, newspapers, journalists that are seen to be kind of on different sides of different divides. And so you see, I think it's less about NGOs and charities and more a battle over kind of like which editorial lines are being taken, which journalists are allowed to say what. One of the most striking things about the dissident spheres involves a lot of journalists who are either in exile or kind of like will at least at that point would like publish the newspaper column that wasn't allowed to be run that week. And Twitter became an outlet for that. You can imagine other social media platforms kind of serving the same role. But I don't think we saw as much about NGOs and charities in this case.
All right, thanks everyone. I think we're just about out of time. We only had one other question left. I don't know if you want to give it a quick, take a quick moment to do that, answer our postdoctoral fellow Lindsay Hundley's question. For the pro-PTI and pro-military posters coordinating behavior, can you say more on which topics they diverge? I'm wondering if this can reveal information about the stability of their alignment.
That's a great question. They largely don't diverge. They end up converging on three key issues. The first one was judicial activism, court cases against what they perceive as corrupt politicians. The second key issue they converge on is corruption itself. And then the third issue they converge on is India, talking about India. I think, yeah. So there's more convergence and there's no sort of real divergence, at least in the lead up to this election. So, and I think that's indicative of the health of this alliance, which has persisted since, I think in the online sphere as well as in the offline context.
I would just add that one last thing, that what we measured were topics that we measured kind of ex ante we were interested in. We could, however, look at divergence on other topics and sentiments that we haven't measured directly. So I think that actually could be something we could explore a little bit more and see if there are other topics, maybe more nuanced ones, where we do see this divergence. So thanks for this thought.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for joining us for a terrific seminar. Thank you so much, Paul, Tamar, and Asfandyar for sharing a really interesting paper and research, and look forward to seeing everyone again at our next seminar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.